Okay, so hello and welcome back to um, my YouTube career. Um, I hope we're all doing well and lesson one and two all made sense and the videos were useful. Uh, I want to skip forward a few slides here first because, uh, yeah, I want to get to the main meat of today's lesson. Today's lesson is all about how effective can Parliament be at carrying out its functions. Now, we learned what its functions were last lesson. In fact, you can see them up here and the point of this activity here would be to decide whether these were a function of the Commons or the function of the Lords. And I'm sure you know these. We're going to go through them a little bit. This was from last lesson, this activity as well. But let's have a look at this page. So you should be on this page in your note taker. And what I asked you guys to do was to code in this lesson whether it was a House of Commons, a House of Lords, or a feature of both houses. So to just go through them. So the House of Commons, these are features that exist for the House of Commons. Number one, that each member of the House of Commons is elected from a constituency, not true in the Lords. Number two, 59 constituencies in Scotland and Wales. There's only 40, in Northern Ireland there's 18, and in the rest of England there's over 500. There was a proposal to reduce this, but that has not been enacted. We still have 650 in the UK as a whole. All represent a political party. There are a few, very, very few independent MPs, as we've mentioned in previous lessons, unlike in the Lords. You've got the front bench sitting here and the back benches sitting back there on both sides. Do much of the work in committees. We'll look at those, and these are some other key features. So you should have got these as, or coded these as House of Commons features. House of Lords features, this is them here in their lovely gowns. They wear gowns on special occasions, and they look very fancy, don't they? Very nice. So their governing party will never ever have an overall majority in the House of Lords, unlike in the House of Commons, where almost by definition, because of our system of parliamentary government, as you know, the Commons, they do have an overall majority. In the Lords, they never will, and that's because there's multiple different parties represented, as well as people that represent no party at all. Proceedings of the House are also presided over by the Speaker. That is true in the Commons and in the Lords. They're divided into the front bench and the back bench, and again that's true in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, but the cross bench is something that is only existent in the House of Lords, and this is the cross benches. They sit here in this cross manner. I guess they're sitting across from both sides, hence they're cross benches. The size of it has evolved gradually over history. There's been attempts to make it more democratic, but it has failed. There's no official legal size for it, unlike in the Commons, which has 650. And there are a lot of people that criticise how new Lords are created. 92 members of the House of Lords are hereditary, as we've discussed already, and the vast majority, though, are life peers. 26 members are archbishops or bishops of the Church of England. The majority of members of this house keep a position for the rest of their life. Most members are nominated by the Prime Minister or major party leaders, and that's done generally in proportion to the size of the party's majority in the House of Commons. The governing party does not ever really have an overall majority because there's always more peers that are not members or whipped by the governing party, and that makes the Lords a lot more independent from the executive, and potentially you could argue a bit more powerful than the executive. Than the Commons in holding the executive to account at certain points, particularly if the executive have a massive majority in the Commons. And finally, the governing party will. Oh well, that's the same one. But there you go. There are members of this House who follow no party line, and those are the crossbenchers. So that was the first activity that you should have got done on your note taker. The second one was about the functions. So we've looked at the features of the two houses. What about the functions? Okay, these are the two houses and their two functions. You can see that there are more in the House of Commons than in the House of Lords. But what I wanted to introduce with this activity was an acronym. You know I like acronyms, they're very useful for us to revise. And this acronym is the LLRDS, or Lords. It's obviously quite catchy, but Lords. Lords are the functions of both Houses of Commons and the House of Commons. So legislate, legitimate, represent, debate, and scrutinise, or to bring about scrutiny. So the reason I use these is because I think that all of these here can fit into these particular definitions, okay? So to legislate meaning to pass laws, to legitimate meaning to give legitimacy to the powers used and the laws passed by government and parliament, to represent. We're going to look at that in a future lesson, in that next lesson, about what that might mean, but there are different types of representation. But certainly both houses, in some sense, represent the public or the citizens of the UK, to debate issues, and that's going to be something that you're going to look at in today's lesson and for your homework, and to scrutinise. And you would have gone through these, read through them and decided which one was which. So, the two things to do with the sheet is first off decide, is this something the House of Commons do or the House of Lords? They're pretty obvious, some of them. Some of them mention House of Lords, some of them mention House of Commons. So I think probably that's a bit straightforward. The more difficult bit is to decide, does that refer to its function to legitimate, legislate, represent, debate, or scrutinise? And here are your answers. For the Commons, you should have got these. Okay, so these would have fitted in to our definitions of legitimation, legislation, representation, debate, and scrutiny. And you can see within representation there are two types of representation referred to, and we're kind of going to talk about these being social representation and these being political representation. And here under scrutiny we see two types of scrutiny. First off, scrutiny of laws being passed or laws being made by government and passed by Parliament. And then secondly, scrutiny of the actions of government as a whole. And again, we're going to look at those in more detail, but those are the functions of the Commons. The functions of the Lords, we still have those 5, but we're going to see that actually it's not as, let's say, burdensome for the House of Lords. Legitimation, they don't provide that much at all. They're not elected. Legislation, they do help a lot, and we talked about their role of looking closely at particular pieces of law that are being proposed by the government. Representation, they do not offer any political representation. They don't represent any constituencies, but they do, in some sense, represent a section of society. And indeed, representation should be understood by that. I'm actually looking at this now and thinking, is that correct? Maybe it's not. Maybe I should move that. So if I look at a great deal of legislation emerging from the government is actually secondary legislation. Secondary legislation, sometimes called delegated legislation, refers to laws or lawmaking or changes to the law that are being made by any government member, which do not need to pass through normal parliamentary procedures. So that would probably go in here. And then this would go in here. So live editing, as you can see. If you look here, then we see representation does not have anything in it, and I think that's partly because their political representation is null. There is no political representation. They may argue in this particular section, they could talk about their social representation of particular sections of society, lawyers, doctors, scientists, but that's a relatively weak argument given that a lot of them come from very high privileged and socially privileged backgrounds, something we'll look at in later lessons. Debate, they do take part in debate on important national issues. However, a lot of these debates relate to moral or ethical decisions rather than big hot political debates. They try to stay out of the debate over Brexit because there was obviously a big big problem with some arguing that Lords is not democratic, so it shouldn't have a say on the future of Brexit. And finally, scrutiny. Lords do have the power of delay, but only for a year, so they can scrutinise the law that a government is passing. They basically have the right to say to government, think again, have a look at this, and if you're really sure, we'll pass it, okay? But they do not have a power of veto. They lost that in 1911. So, today's lesson, I wanted to talk a little bit about this particular case study of the war in Syria, or sorry, should I say very specifically, what happened in March 2018. So in March 2018, Theresa May was Prime Minister. Jeremy Corbyn was Leader of the Opposition. He stands down this week, but at that point he was Leader of the Opposition. May led a very, very weak and wobbly government. She had a very small, she did not have a majority. She had a very small kind of working majority, having got a supply and confidence agreement with the DUP. And overnight, there was news that came through that President Assad had used chemical weapons against some of his own people, rebels within Syria. And Theresa May, alongside Donald Trump, wanted to take military action to bomb some of the potential sites where these chemical weapons had been developed. Now, the Labour opposition at that time were not very comfortable with the idea of using force because they believed that it would not at all aid the process of bringing Assad to justice, and there was a belief that Syria could not be helped with more weapons given the fact that it had experienced already by 2018 7 years of civil war. And so what we're going to look at is a particular story that came out at the time, and I'm going to get out of this and just bring up that particular story. So that story is this. It was attached in your lesson, and I hope you had a chance to read it. And the title is Syria Bombing. Jeremy Corbyn warns or calls for War Powers Act to limit the government's ability to launch airstrikes without asking MPs first. So what happened here was that Theresa May decided, we want to take part in this military action, but I don't know if we have enough MPs in Parliament. And at that point, she said, okay, you might not have enough MPs in Parliament, but I do have the prerogative powers. I do have those powers that were given to me as part of a kind of hand down from the royal prerogative or from the monarch that I now can use to use military force as Commander-in-Chief. We've learnt about that in the PM and Cabinet, and this is when she decided, well, it might be easier to do that than going through Parliament. And so she decided to do that. She avoided going to Parliament, and she took part in the airstrikes that the US and the French were also keen to take part in May 2018. And Jeremy Corbyn was very critical, saying that this action had not been scrutinised by Parliament, that the Parliament needed to understand the extent of the actions taken, the intelligence used, and that Parliament needed to exercise its function of scrutiny. Whereas Theresa May said, no, it's part of a convention. I have the power to launch UK forces at my disposal because I am Commander-in-Chief. And it's just really important, this paragraph here I wanted to highlight, put it in bold for you guys, but it says here, Mrs May sidestepped a non-binding constitutional convention which dates back to 2003 but by launching strikes without prior approval from Parliament. So since 2003, despite the fact that the UK had Prime Minister has Commander-in-Chief powers, they had not used any force or airstrikes without the approval of Parliament first. This was a convention that was followed by previous Prime Ministers. But the PM insisted that the speed of the action required was essential and that she could not go to Parliament first. So she could not get the approval of Parliament. So Parliament was not there to legislate on these actions. Parliament was not there even necessarily at the first instance to scrutinise. And this is the kind of conflict between the executive and the legislature, and shows you that even in a situation we have such a weak Prime Minister without any powers, any dominance over her own party, any majority in Parliament at all, she was able to still exercise those prerogative powers. And it shows you the power of a Prime Minister, even at their weakest point, to sidestep, to use that word, Parliament. And what Jeremy Corbyn called for at that time was a War Powers Act, a piece of legislation, a piece of statute, if we're thinking back to our sources of the Constitution, that would limit the power of the executive as a commander-in-chief. It would be a War Powers Act that he proposed that would effectively use statute to overpower convention. And if you know what that means, you've understood what I'm talking about. To use statute, to use the law, the source of the UK Constitution that is acts of Parliament passed to overpower an unwritten convention, an unwritten element of the UK Constitution, which refers to the Prime Minister's prerogative powers as Commander-in-Chief. Okay, so I think that's a really good case study for you to use. And if I was going through the case study, which you guys will be doing, and if I bring it up here, you see I would name the case study event there. I would talk about the issue. I'd mention the strength of the Prime Minister, the size of the majority. There wasn't one. Theresa May was in power. What functions did the Commons fail or fulfil in this case? Well, I would say it wasn't able to fulfil the powers of scrutiny, the function, of scrutiny or legislation, because the Prime Minister overpowered or sidestepped, shall I say, using the convention of prerogative powers. The Lords weren't involved here, so I'd leave that blank. And I'd say, is this an example of Parliament being effective or ineffective? I would say this is an example of Parliament being ineffective, not because of its own fault, but because the executive was able to use its prerogative power to act almost presidentially. Okay, and we talked about that in previous lessons. Could this happen again in 2020? It says 2019. I know we're in 2020 now. And I think the answer is yes. Definitely, the powers of prerogative powers, of Commander-in-Chief could definitely be used again, and potentially would be more likely to be used with a Prime Minister with a majority in Parliament, unlikely to face a backlash of any significant type. So, this is an example of someone who did one from last year. You have your own to do, you'll see at the end of the lesson, in pairs, but this is an example of the Brexit withdrawal bill and how Theresa May tried to get it through. There's another case study here of the functions of Commons fulfilling those functions and potentially over-fulfilling them if you're Theresa May, because they kept on scrutinising it, they kept on seeking to debate it and represent particular elements of the constituents or the public who voted for Brexit or against Brexit, and that led to a bit of a deadlock. So is it an example of Parliament being effective? Well, this person says, ironically, Parliament in this kind of maelstrom that went on in 2018-19 for Theresa May was very effective at scrutiny and debate. In fact, maybe too effective for Theresa May. But it was ineffective at that crucial function, which was to legislate. So if we look at LLRDS, it was really successful at S, scrutiny, and D, debate, but not very successful at L, legislation. And the Commons therefore failed to find a deal before the 2019 general election, threw things up in the air. So your homework tasks that you need to do, number one is so simple. It's literally copy out this sheet. There's a few pages in the textbook. I'm not sure what the pages are, but you can do that. You can find it. And secondly, in pairs, I want you to research your own case study. I've given you one each that relate, particularly some of you relate to some of the study you'll be doing in other subjects, but also because you're in pairs, apart from Darwood, you'll need to contact me if you want some help. But because you're in pairs, you can work together, chat about it. You've got a file to fill it out in. Do it digitally first together, and then you can fill it out in your note taker afterwards. And hopefully, well, you need to get those ready for Monday's lesson. Hopefully we'll have them there. I can have a look at them, comment upon them, and you guys can pick one other of another pair who you like the look of to put into your note taker, because in your note taker you have three spaces. You have one that we just did today in today's lesson with the article about 2018's airstrikes by Theresa May on Syrian chemical weapons factories. You've got one that you're going to do. You're going to research, do digitally first, and then you've got one that another person will digitally do that I will share around, and you can fill in your third case study. These case studies are going to be really, really important when it comes to those essays that we write on the functions and the effectiveness of Parliament, because today's lesson was about the effectiveness of Parliament. By the way, this here is just to test your knowledge. Can you remember LLRDS? I think you probably can. But how effective can Parliament be at carrying out its functions? Today's lesson really allowed us to see that we're starting to assess how effective Parliament can be. There's no good shouting from the rooftop, Parliament's good, Parliament's terrible, unless you know what it's supposed to be doing. And we are getting our head around the LLRDS functions. What we'll be doing in essays is evaluating how effective they are at carrying out those particular functions. And that's where that AO2 debate comes in. Oh, are they effective on legislating? Are they effective on debate? Are they effective on scrutiny? What parts of Parliament are we talking about? And so the answer to this question, how effective can Parliament be? Already we're seeing the answer is it depends. It depends partly on the size of the government's parliamentary majority. I mean, ironically, I showed you an example of the executive overruling a parliament that was actually quite strong structurally. The government had no parliamentary majority. It had to cobble together a deal with the DUP when Theresa May was in power, but she was still able to use prerogative powers. So ironically, because actually if you look at the Brexit example that I gave you, done by a student last year, that's an example of a parliamentary majority having a big effect upon how effective Parliament can be. The simple answer here is parliaments are more effective when governments do not have a majority, because they can step in. It depends on the issue at hand. If it's a really controversial issue, Parliament may take more of a step, take more steps to carry out its functions. If it's a less controversial issue, it may take less steps. And again, you'll see with your case studies when we share them where the issues of controversy pop up. Generally, war is a really good, or shall I say, a really controversial area where Parliament steps up. And it also depends on the part of Parliament we're talking about. When I talked about that example of Theresa May and the War Powers Act, the Lords does not have a role in war powers. They do not take any really active role in looking at approval or non-approval of military force because they don't have that legitimacy. The same on issues such as financial issues about budgets or things that are in manifestos. That's just called the Salisbury Convention. If it's in a manifesto, the House of Lords do not do anything to it because they don't have the legitimacy. So when we talk about Parliament being effective, we need to think about, are we talking about the House of Commons? Are we talking about the House of Lords? And if we are talking about the House of Commons, which part of the House of Commons are we talking about? Backbenchers? Are we talking about the opposition? Are we talking about committees? And that's going to become clearer as the lessons go on. So look, I've talked long enough. That's the lesson. Please ask questions in the comments, and yes, any questions. I hope we are doing okay.